Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight will you find yourself drifting backward into a world that feels heavier, warmer, and strangely more intimate than anything you're used to. A world where every scent in the air seems to carry meaning, and where even silence feels like it is listening back to you. You probably won't survive this in the way you expect, because the story you're about to enter has survived far longer than any single memory you hold right now. It has outlived empires, reshaped economies, and quietly rewired human desire across centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You glance at your surroundings as if they might answer where you are. Maybe you are in a quiet room, maybe a dimly lit evening space, maybe somewhere between wakefulness and sleep itself. Now tell me where you are from and what time it is in your place, because tonight this story travels better when it is shared across distances. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You begin in a humid, green world long before the idea of chocolate has been simplified into wrappers and advertisements. The air is thick with moisture, and the ground beneath your feet feels uneven, as if the earth itself is still learning how to settle. In this place, cacao is not a snack or a treat. It is something closer to breath, ritual, and memory combined. A mainstream historical fact is that cacao was first domesticated in ancient Mesoamerica, long before European contact, where it was prepared as a bitter, frothy drink often mixed with water, spices, and sometimes maize. You notice how different it is from anything familiar. There is no sweetness here, only intensity, foam, and the sharpness of something that demands attention rather than comfort. You walk beside people who treat cacao as something alive. It is poured from one vessel to another until it builds a foam that rises like a fragile crown. The sound is soft but deliberate, like a rhythm practiced over generations. Smoke from nearby fires curls upward, blending with the scent of earth, leaves, and something slightly earthy and floral that you cannot yet name. A quirky tidbit often overlooked is that cacao pods were sometimes so valued that they were used in rituals involving offerings to deities and even shaped into symbolic objects beyond food. In some rare accounts, small carved representations were placed alongside real beans, blurring the line between nourishment and meaning. You notice how people here do not separate utility from symbolism. Everything carries weight beyond itself. You watch as hands carefully split open cacao pods. Inside, the seeds are surrounded by a soft, white pulp that feels almost alien in contrast to what chocolate will one day become. Nothing here resembles sweetness yet. Instead, everything feels preparatory, like the world is still assembling the idea of pleasure. The people around you speak in calm, measured tones. Their language flows like water over stone. You do not fully understand it, but you can sense that cacao is tied to identity, ceremony, and hierarchy. It is not casually shared. It is prepared, witnessed, and respected. You sit nearby as a vessel is passed between individuals. The drink is thick, slightly bitter, and topped with foam that holds its shape for only a moment before dissolving back into liquid. When you take a sip, the taste is surprising. It is not pleasant in the modern sense. It is grounding, almost demanding. It tells you to pay attention. Historians still argue whether cacao's earliest use was primarily ritualistic or whether it emerged first as a daily nutritional drink that later gained sacred status. The truth seems to shift depending on which fragment of evidence you examine. You find yourself thinking that perhaps it was never just one thing at all. The air hums with activity, not loud activity, but constant movement. People carrying goods, exchanging objects, adjusting fabrics, and tending fires that never seem to fully die. Everything feels connected to cacao in some indirect way, as if this plant quietly anchors the rhythm of life around it. You notice how posture changes when cacao is present. Shoulders straighten slightly, conversation slow, even laughter feels more deliberate. It is as if the drink imposes its own gravity on the room. There is a moment where you almost forget you are observing a history. It feels instead like participation. The boundaries blur between watcher and participant, between modern understanding and ancient experience. You realize that what you now call chocolate begins here as something closer to ceremony than comfort. A breeze passes through the settlement, carrying the scent of wet earth and crushed leaves. Somewhere nearby, water is poured again into a vessel, and the foam rises once more. The repetition is soothing, almost hypnotic. You start to understand that repetition itself is part of the ritual, not just the result of it. You lean back slightly, as if your body instinctively recognizes that nothing here needs to be rushed. Time in this place does not push forward. It settles, like sediment in a river. And somewhere deep in this early world, cacao continues its quiet transformation, waiting for centuries it does not yet know it will survive. You remain in the same ancient current of time, but now the world around you begins to open outward, as if the dense ritual space of cacao is only one small clearing in a much larger forest of human attention. The humidity is still present, pressing lightly against your skin, but the landscape feels more expansive. Trees stretch higher, paths extend further. Life around cacao becomes less ceremonial in isolation and more integrated into an entire ecological system that quietly supports it. You walk into the cacao forests themselves. The canopy above you is layered and uneven, allowing fragments of sunlight to fall through in shifting patterns. Each step on the ground releases faint scents of soil, decaying leaves, and something subtly sweet that hints at fruit you cannot yet see. The trees are not wild in the chaotic sense. They are carefully tended, even in their ancient form, as if human presence has already begun shaping them without fully domesticating them in the modern agricultural sense. A mainstream historical fact is that early Mesoamerican societies practiced forms of agroforestry, cultivating cacao alongside other plants such as maize, avocado, and chili peppers, creating biodiverse systems that sustained both nutrition and trade. You begin to notice this structure around you. Nothing is isolated. Every plant seems to support another, forming a living network rather than a single crop field. You see hands moving gently among the trees. People here do not rush. They observe. They wait. Cacao pods hang directly from trunks and thicker branches, their colours ranging from deep green to yellow and reddish brown. Each pod is like a closed container of potential, heavy with seeds that will eventually travel far beyond this forest. The harvesting is careful, almost reverent. Cutting too aggressively could damage future growth, and so every motion carries awareness. A quirky tidbit from early botanical accounts suggests that cacao trees were sometimes associated with specific spiritual guardians in certain communities, where individual trees were treated almost like family members with their own identity and protective significance. You notice how this belief changes behaviour. People do not simply harvest, they negotiate with the plant, as if asking permission through ritualised care. You crouch beside a freshly opened pod. Inside, the seeds are arranged tightly, surrounded by a soft white pulp that glistens slightly in the filtered light. The texture is unexpected, almost fragile. You realise that what will one day become chocolate begins here in a state that is perishable, sensitive, and entirely dependent on human handling. You watch as seeds are scooped out and placed into containers for fermentation. This process is not immediate. It requires time, warmth, and controlled decay. The smell changes as it happens, shifting from sweet pulp to deeper, more complex aromas. Even here, transformation is never sudden. It is layered, slow and slightly unpredictable. Historians still argue whether fermentation techniques were discovered intentionally or emerged accidentally through storage practices that later became standardized. You think about how many human innovations begin in accident and end in ritual. Nothing here feels purely deliberate in the modern sense. It feels adapted over time, refined through repetition rather than invention. As you follow the flow of cacao deeper into the forest system, you notice how trade begins at a very small scale. Not global trade yet, not empire trade, but something intimate. Neighbors exchanging bundles, families passing goods along paths worn smooth by repeated footsteps. The forest itself feels like a living corridor of exchange. You hear distant sounds of activity, not loud, but layered. Voices calling out measurements, the rustle of baskets being adjusted, the soft impact of pods being collected. Even the wind seems to move differently here, as if it has learned the rhythm of human presence. You are shown how cacao is prepared after harvest. Seeds are left in piles, covered lightly with leaves or woven materials. Heat builds slowly. Microbial activity begins its unseen work. What looks like decay is actually transformation. You realize that cacao depends on this controlled breakdown to become something desirable later. Without it, the flavor would never evolve beyond raw bitterness. A subtle tension exists in this process. Too much heat and everything is lost, too little and nothing changes. The balance is fragile, and it depends entirely on human observation. You start to understand that early chocolate production is less about manufacturing and more about careful stewardship of natural processes. You walk along a narrow path where cacao is being transported. Containers are carried by hand or balanced carefully in woven baskets. Movement is steady but continuous. There is no pause in the system because freshness is time-sensitive. Everything must flow. A mainstream historical fact is that cacao eventually became one of the key trade goods in Mesoamerican economies, valued not only for consumption, but also for its role in exchange systems that predated European currency influence. You begin to see how even in these early moments, cacao is already more than food. It is structure. It is coordination. In the distance, you notice a gathering space where cacao is processed further. Here, seeds are dried, sorted, and prepared for future use. The atmosphere is more organized. There is a sense of quiet efficiency that contrasts with the forest's organic sprawl. Humans are shaping raw nature into something that can travel beyond its origin. A quirky tidbit mentions that cacao processing areas sometimes developed informal social hierarchies based on skill in sorting or preparing beans, where experienced individuals were trusted with determining quality and readiness. You observe how expertise becomes invisible authority. No crowns, no titles, just hands that know what to look for. You pause and look back toward the forest canopy. Light filters through leaves in slow pulses as wind moves above. It feels like the entire environment is breathing. You begin to suspect that cacao is not just part of this world. It is one of its organizing principles, quietly structuring time, labor, and interaction. You realize something subtle. The people here are not simply cultivating cacao, they are living within its cycles: growth, fermentation, drying, transport, preparation. Each stage creates its own rhythm, and human life adjusts around it without resistance. As you continue walking, you feel the shift beginning, not yet toward Europe, not yet toward global transformation, but towards scale. The system you are observing is no longer just local. It is becoming expandable, capable of reaching beyond forest edges, beyond regional memory, and somewhere ahead. Cacao is preparing for a journey it does not yet understand. The forest begins to feel quieter as you move forward, not because sound has disappeared, but because meaning itself has deepened. Everything around you now carries a kind of weight that goes beyond observation. The cacao trees, the human movement, the slow exchanges of goods, all of it feels increasingly tied to something larger than daily survival. You are no longer just watching a crop being used. You are stepping into a belief system where nature and divinity are not separate categories. You pass from the working edges of cacao cultivation into spaces where the plant is no longer only handled but interpreted. Here, stories begin to surround it. People do not simply explain cacao. They situate it within origin myths, divine genealogies, and moral lessons about how the world itself is structured. A mainstream historical fact is that in many Mesoamerican cultures, cacao was associated with sacred origin stories and was often linked to deities connected with fertility, knowledge, and creation. You feel this immediately in the way people speak about it. There is hesitation before casual references, as if even naming cacao requires awareness of its larger meaning. You're invited to sit near a gathering where elders speak in slow, deliberate tones. The air feels still, as though even the environment is listening. Cacao is present again, but now it is not only a drink or trade good, it is a symbol, a narrative object, a bridge between human life and forces that are described as older than memory. A quirky tidbit from some surviving codex interpretations suggests that cacao was sometimes depicted in ritual imagery as growing from sacred landscapes shaped by divine action, where mountains, rivers, and even human settlements were considered extensions of a cosmic design. You notice how storytelling here does not separate geography from meaning. The land itself is part of the myth. You watch as a prepared cacao drink is offered during a ceremonial moment. The foam rises slowly again, but now its appearance feels different. It is not just texture, it is expression. The movement of liquid is interpreted as a reflection of balance between forces. You begin to understand that even sensory experience is read symbolically. Historians still argue whether cacao's sacred status emerged primarily from elite religious institutions or whether it was already embedded in everyday practice before being formalized by priestly interpretation. Standing here, you realize that both possibilities might be true at once. Everyday life and sacred structure are not separate threads. Around you, there are woven textiles, carved objects, and carefully arranged offerings. Everything seems intentional but not rigid. It feels more like a dialogue than a command. Humans respond to the environment, and in turn, the environment is described as responding back through ritual practice. You notice how cacao is often placed alongside other symbolic elements. Maize appears frequently, sometimes chili, sometimes ceremonial feathers or incense. Nothing exists alone. Everything is part of a relational system where meaning is distributed across objects rather than contained within them. You are shown a narrative scene where cacao is described as a gift, not merely a plant discovered, but something received. The language used is careful, almost respectful, as if cacao carries agency in its own origin story. You feel the subtle shift in perception. This is no longer agriculture. It is cosmology expressed through agriculture. A mainstream historical fact is that cacao was used in elite rituals and offerings, often reserved for rulers, priests, and ceremonial gatherings, reinforcing social structure through controlled access to valued substances. You begin to see how power and belief intertwine. Access to cacao is not just economic, it is symbolic of position within a larger worldview. You sit slightly apart from the main gathering, observing how conversation flows. There is laughter, but it is restrained. There is storytelling, but it is structured. Even silence feels intentional. You realize that cacao is not only consumed for its physical effects, but also for the way it organizes attention. A quirky tidbit from some ethnographic interpretations suggests that in certain contexts, cacao preparation was accompanied by rhythmic gestures or specific pouring techniques that were believed to influence the quality of the final foam, almost as if technique itself could shape spiritual outcome. You watch the repetition of motion and begin to understand why such beliefs would persist. The physical act itself is mesmerizing. The drink is passed again, and you take another sip. The bitterness is still present, but now it is layered with context. You're no longer experiencing flavor in isolation. You're experiencing meaning embedded in taste. The foam touches your lips and dissolves quickly, like a thought that refuses to stay still. You begin to notice that stories about cacao often describe transformation, not just consumption. Seeds becoming drink, drink becoming ritual, ritual becoming identity. Everything is about passage from one state to another. Nothing remains fixed. Historians still argue whether cacao's symbolic association with vitality and fertility was primarily metaphorical, or whether it was believed to carry literal life-sustaining properties beyond nutrition. You reflect on how ancient people often did not separate metaphor from reality in the way modern thinking tends to. The gathering begins to shift in tone. Voices soften further, movements slow. The space feels like it is transitioning into reflection. You sense that cacao is acting as a mediator between ordinary time and ceremonial time, stretching moments into something more deliberate. You are shown how knowledge about cacao is passed down, not through manuals or fixed texts, but through observation and participation. Yo! Younger individuals watch older ones prepare it. Corrections are subtle, sometimes just a pause, sometimes a repeated motion. Learning is embedded in rhythm. As the gathering continues, you notice that cacao is not only sacred in isolation, but also deeply social. It is used to reinforce bonds, to mark agreements, to structure hospitality. Offering cacao is an act that carries expectation and acknowledgement. It signals recognition between people. A mainstream historical fact is that cacao functioned as both a ritual substance and a social connector, reinforcing relationships through shared consumption in communal and elite settings. You begin to see how something so simple in material form can carry such complex social meaning. The environment around you begins to feel less like a forest and more like a network of meanings layered over geography. Trees are still trees, but they're also participants in a system of belief. Paths are still paths, but they're also lines of ritual movement. You take a final look at the gathering as it settles into quiet continuity. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no clear ending. Instead, there is persistence. Cacao continues to circulate, to be prepared, to be spoken about, to be shared. And somewhere beyond this world of myth and meaning, cacao is already beginning to move outward again, preparing for encounters that will reshape it entirely. The world around you shifts again, but not abruptly. It changes the way memory changes, gradually replacing one layer of understanding with another, until you only realize afterward that the entire atmosphere is different. The ceremonial forest fades into something more structured, more socially layered, and far more densely human. You are no longer at the symbolic edge of cacao culture. You are now inside its daily pulse. You arrive in a Maya settlement where cacao is not distant or rare. It is present in circulation, embedded into ordinary rhythms of life. The air carries a mixture of smoke from cooking fires, damp earth from recent rains, and the faint, unmistakable scent of prepared cacao. It is no longer hidden in ritual spaces alone. It moves through households, courtyards, and gathering areas like a shared language. A widely accepted historical understanding is that cacao was deeply integrated into Maya social and economic systems, functioning as both a prestigious drink and a regulated medium of exchange among different social classes. You observe how this integration feels natural here, not imposed. People do not treat cacao as extraordinary. They treat it as structured normality. You stand at the edge of a courtyard where activity is steady but unhurried. Large ceramic vessels rest near shaded areas, some filled with cacao drink, others being prepared. The foam is still important, still carefully produced, but now it appears in more frequent contexts. It is not reserved only for sacred moments. It appears in hospitality, negotiation, and daily gathering. A lesser-known anthropological observation notes that cacao preparation techniques sometimes varied subtly between households and regions, producing differences in foam texture and flavour that were recognised socially, almost like informal signatures of identity. You begin to notice how people can identify origin through sensory detail alone. Inside one of the larger structures, scribes are working with folded materials, recording tribute and exchanges. Their focus is absolute. Cacao appears here again, not physically but economically. It is part of accounting, part of record-keeping, part of the invisible structure that holds society together. You realize that cacao exists simultaneously as substance and system. You are offered a small cup. The setting is calmer than earlier ceremonial spaces, yet still layered with meaning. The drink is smoother now, slightly more refined in preparation. You notice how familiarity changes perception. The bitterness is still present, but it no longer dominates. It integrates into the overall experience. Historians still debate the extent to which cacao consumption in Maya society was restricted by class versus broadly accessible in different forms across regions and time periods. What you see suggests both hierarchy and diffusion at once. Elites clearly control presentation, yet ordinary access exists in parallel forms. You walk through a marketplace area where goods are exchanged in steady flow, not chaotic, but coordinated. You see textiles, food, crafted objects, and containers of cacao beans changing hands. Each exchange feels deliberate. Value is not abstract here. It is visible, countable, and tactile. A curious historical observation from archaeological interpretations suggests that cacao beans were sometimes stored and transported in standardized bundles, hinting at early forms of regulated trade measurement that helped stabilize exchange systems across regions. You notice how organization emerges naturally when value becomes widely recognized. Conversations around you are calm but constant. People discuss obligations, offerings, agreements, and social ties. Cacao often appears as part of these discussions, not always physically present, but always conceptually relevant. It acts as a reference point for trust and responsibility. You begin to understand that cacao is not just consumed, it is embedded into relationships. Offering it is a gesture of recognition. Receiving it is acknowledgement of status or connection. Even absence of cacao in certain situations carries meaning. A different strand of scholarly interpretation emphasizes cacao's role in reinforcing elite authority through controlled distribution, where access to prepared drink signaled inclusion within specific social tiers. You see how power operates quietly here, not through force, but through regulated experience. As you move further into the settlement, you notice domestic spaces where cacao preparation is part of household rhythm. Women and men engage in different stages of processing. From grinding to mixing to serving, the work is skilled, repetitive, and precise. You watch the grinding process closely. The movement is rhythmic, almost meditative. Seeds are transformed into paste, then mixed with water and other ingredients. The sound of grinding stone against material becomes part of the background soundscape of life itself. A lesser documented ethnographic detail suggests that certain cacao preparations were adjusted based on seasonal conditions, with variations in texture and temperature reflecting environmental adaptation rather than fixed recipe traditions. you begin to see how flexible knowledge systems can be when they are lived rather than written. Children move through the space as well, observing and occasionally assisting in small tasks. Learning is embedded in proximity. There is no separation between education and daily participation. You realize that cultural transmission here is continuous rather than formalized. You are shown a moment of hospitality where cacao is served to visitors. The act is simple but carefully performed. There is a pause before drinking, a moment of acknowledgement, a shared understanding that this is more than refreshment. It is social connection made tangible. Historians still discuss whether cacao functioned more strongly as a luxury marker or as a widely shared cultural staple during different phases of Maya development. As evidence shifts across regions and centuries, what you observe is a spectrum rather than a fixed category. The settlement begins to feel like a living organism organized around cycles of preparation, exchange, and consumption. Nothing feels static, everything is in motion, but in controlled, familiar patterns. You take a final look at the courtyard as activity continues without interruption. Cacao flows through hands, vessels, and conversations with quiet consistency. It is not central in a dramatic sense, it is central in a structural sense. And as you remain in this rhythm, you begin to sense that cacao's journey is expanding again, moving beyond the boundaries of this world into something far larger and more unpredictable. The settlement begins to fade behind you, not by disappearance but by gradual replacement, like a woven pattern slowly giving way to a different thread. The soundscape changes first. The steady domestic rhythm of cacao preparation and household exchanges softens into something more transactional, more layered with negotiation. You realize you are entering a space where cacao is no longer only a social drink or household presence. It is becoming an instrument of value itself. You step into a broader network of movement, where paths are busier and exchanges more formalized. People are not just preparing cacao anymore, they are counting it, transporting it, and discussing it with precision that suggests it holds standardized worth. The atmosphere feels like a living marketplace, but not chaotic. Everything moves with intent, as if guided by shared understanding rather than written rules. A widely recognized historical fact is that cacao beans functioned as a form of currency in several Mesoamerican societies, used for purchasing goods such as food, textiles, and services. You observe this reality unfolding naturally around you. Small bundles of cacao beans change hands with quiet certainty, replacing abstract numbers with physical objects you can actually see and weigh. You watch a transaction take place, a woven container is opened, and carefully counted beans are transferred from one hand to another. There is no hesitation. The exchange is quick, but not rushed. It carries the calm efficiency of a system that everyone understands without needing explanation. A lesser-known economic observation notes that standardized counts of cacao beans were sometimes used to maintain consistency in trade, even though natural variation in bean size occasionally required adjustments in valuation. You notice how people here compensate for imperfection through shared practice rather than strict measurement tools. As you move deeper into this exchange network, you begin to understand that cacao is not simply a medium of value, it is trust made visible. When someone accepts cacao, they are not only accepting goods, they are accepting the reliability of the system itself. The air feels warmer here, not physically, but socially. Conversations overlap more frequently. You hear discussions about routes, supplies, obligations, and upcoming gatherings. Cacao appears constantly in speech. Even when it is not physically present, it becomes shorthand for exchange, expectation, and responsibility. A different strand of historical interpretation suggests that cacao's role as currency may have emerged from its dual identity as both consumable luxury and ritual substance. making it uniquely suited to carry symbolic and practical value at the same time. You begin to see how something so sensory can become structural in society. You pass through a space where goods are displayed in rows. Textiles hang beside pottery. Food items are arranged with care. And among them, cacao beans sit in containers that are simple but deliberate. Nothing here is decorative for its own sake. Everything is positioned to communicate value. You notice that people rarely hoard cacao in visible ways. It moves too frequently for that. It circulates. It transforms hands constantly, creating a flow that feels more like water than storage. Wealth here is not static. It is movement. A quirky historical detail recorded in some colonial-era accounts, later interpreted cautiously by researchers, suggests that cacao beans were sometimes counterfeited by hollowing or reshaping other materials to resemble genuine beans, revealing early forms of economic deception tied to high-value goods. You reflect on how systems of trust always generate systems of imitation. You watch a group of traders adjust their bundles after discussion. There is no tension, only correction. Values are recalibrated through conversation, not enforcement. You realize that agreement is maintained socially rather than imposed externally. Historians still debate whether cacao's function as currency was primarily stable and standardized, or whether its value fluctuated significantly across regions and seasons depending on the local availability and political conditions. What you see suggests a system flexible enough to adapt, yet consistent enough to sustain widespread use. You move along a path that connects market areas to residential zones. The transition is subtle. Even within homes, cacao remains present, not only as drink but as stored value. Containers are kept in secure but familiar places. Wealth here is not abstracted into symbols. It remains physical, touchable, and perishable. You observe a household preparing cacao for both consumption and exchange. Some is ground, some is stored, some is set aside carefully. The distinction between eating and saving is not rigid. It is fluid, depending on need and circumstance. A lesser-known anthropological insight notes that in some regions cacao beans were treated with care, practices similar to those given to durable goods, including specific storage methods designed to preserve their usability as both food and currency over time. You begin to understand how preservation itself becomes part of economic behavior. The marketplace grows more active as the day progresses. You hear announcements of arrivals, descriptions of goods, and negotiations unfolding in steady rhythm. Feels hurried, yet nothing is idle. The system depends on constant motion. You notice how people carry cacao differently depending on intent. Some bundles are small and precise, meant for immediate exchange. Others are larger, intended for longer-term storage or future negotiation. Even without explicit labeling, purpose is visible in form. A widely accepted historical interpretation emphasizes that cacao's portability and divisibility made it especially suitable for pre-modern exchange systems, allowing it to function across different social and geographic contexts without losing recognition. You see this adaptability reflected in every interaction. As you continue walking, you begin to sense how cacao structures not only economy but also time. Payments are scheduled, exchanges are anticipated, obligations extend forward into future moments. Cacao becomes a way of organizing expectation. A quirky observation from early ethnographic reconstructions suggests that certain ceremonial exchanges of cacao may have been timed to align with seasonal events or communal gatherings, reinforcing both economic and social cycles simultaneously. You notice how time itself feels coordinated here. The sun shifts slightly, casting longer shadows across the market space. Activity continues, but the tone subtly changes. Transactions become slower, conversations more reflective. You realize that even markets have rhythms tied to natural cycles. Historians still argue whether cacao-based currency systems were primarily driven by elite administrative control, or whether they emerged organically from widespread communal practice before being formalized by governing structures. Standing here, you see elements of both interpretation blending together. You pause near the edge of the marketplace and look back. What appears is not just commerce, but a living network of relationships mediated through a plant. Cacao is everywhere, not as background, but as connective tissue, and somewhere beyond this structured exchange, beyond counting and trade. Cacao is already preparing for a transformation that will carry it far outside this world entirely. The marketplace slowly dissolves behind you, not by silence, but by transformation into something far larger and more imposing. The pathways widen, the air feels heavier, charged with authority rather than simple exchange. You're no longer moving through a decentralized web of trade. You're entering a system where cacao is no longer just value or social glue, it has become a mechanism of power. You approach a vast urban center, and even before you see its full structure, you feel its organization. Roads align more deliberately. Movement becomes directional rather than organic. People still carry cacao, but now it is accompanied by hierarchy, obligation, and surveillance of a kind that is subtle but constant. Everything feels accounted for. A widely recognized historical fact is that cacao was used by the Aztec Empire as a tribute commodity, collected from subject regions and transported into the capital as part of a structured imperial economy. You begin to understand how cacao shifts meaning again here. It is no longer just circulating, it is flowing upward into concentrated power. As you enter the city, the scale changes immediately. Structures rise in layered formations, canals and causeways organize movement. The soundscape becomes denser, filled with overlapping voices, footsteps, and the constant rhythm of labor. Amid this complexity, cacao remains present, but its role is now embedded within administrative control. You observe officials overseeing collections, cacao beans are counted with precision, recorded, and redistributed according to strict expectations. There is no casual exchange here. Everything is regulated. Even the act of offering cacao carries implication of status and obligation. A lesser-known administrative detail suggests that tribute systems sometimes categorize cacao by quality and origin, assigning different values to beans depending on their perceived condition, which introduced a structured hierarchy even within the same commodity. You notice how even uniform objects become stratified under power. You walk through storage spaces where large quantities of cacao are held. The containers are arranged carefully, not for aesthetic reasons, but for efficiency and control. Guards and scribes move through these spaces with practiced familiarity. The atmosphere is calm, but it is a controlled calm, like something constantly being monitored. A widely accepted historical interpretation emphasizes that cacao played a key role in sustaining imperial economies, not only as a luxury item but as a standardized form of tribute that supported administrative and military systems. You begin to see how deeply embedded it is within the functioning of authority itself. You are led toward a ceremonial space within the city. Here, cacao appears again in a different form, not as currency or tribute, but as ritual offering tied to governance. Leaders consume cacao in structured settings that reinforce both spiritual legitimacy and political authority. The drink becomes symbolic of power itself. You watch as cacao is prepared with care. Foam is still essential, still carefully produced, but now its presence feels formalized, almost codified. The act of serving is as important as the substance being served. Every motion is deliberate, every pause meaningful. A quirky historical note from early accounts suggests that cacao preparation in elite contexts sometimes involved specialized tools or ceremonial vessels that distinguished noble consumption from ordinary preparation, reinforcing visual and sensory markers of hierarchy. you notice how even taste is shaped by structure. The room you're in feels elevated, both physically and socially. Conversations here are quieter, more precise. Decisions are made in measured tones. Cacao is present in these exchanges not as background, but as part of the atmosphere of authority. You begin to see how tribute arrives from distant regions. Caravans and porters bring cacao into the city through organized routes. These journeys are long, coordinated, and essential. Without them, the city's structure would weaken. Cacao is not just consumed here, it is accumulated. A lesser-known logistical observation notes that tribute systems often require detailed tracking of routes and delivery schedules, indicating a high level of coordination across vast territories, even without modern transport systems. You realize how complexity can exist without technology, sustained instead by human organization. As you move through different layers of the city, you notice how cacao appears at multiple levels of society. At the top, it signifies authority and ritual legitimacy. At the administrative level, it represents record-keeping and control. At the lower levels, it still circulates in more familiar forms, connecting everyday life to imperial structure. You pass workers engaged in labor-intensive tasks. Some are involved in transport, others in preparation or storage. Cacao moves through all of these roles. Linking them together, it becomes a thread that connects labor, governance, and consumption into a single system. A widely recognized anthropological understanding is that cacao's integration into Aztec society reflected a complex economy where ritual, trade, and political authority were deeply interconnected rather than separated into distinct domains. You see this integration everywhere around you. You pause near a distribution point where cacao is being allocated. The process is orderly, almost mechanical in its consistency, yet behind it lies a deeply human structure of coordination, trust, and expectation. Nothing functions without participation at every level. A quirky interpretive detail from colonial-era documentation suggests that cacao sometimes carried symbolic associations beyond economics, including its use in social ceremonies that marked alliances, disputes, and transitions in leadership roles. You begin to see how flexible its meaning has become across contexts. The city feels alive with controlled movement. Nothing is random. Even crowd flow seems organized. Cacao is part of this structure, not as an object alone, but as a stabilizing force that allows such complexity to exist without collapse. Historians still argue whether the Aztec reliance on cacao tribute systems made their economy more resilient or more vulnerable to external disruption, especially during periods of political expansion and contact with foreign powers. Standing in this system, you can sense both strength and fragility intertwined. You observe how cacao is stored not only in physical containers, but in institutional memory, records, oral traditions, and administrative habits all reinforce its value. It is not just a commodity, it is a principle of organization. As the light shifts across the city, you realize how deeply cacao has been absorbed into every layer of existence here, from ritual to economy to governance. It no longer belongs to a single category, it defines relationships between categories, and beyond these structured walls of empire, cacao is already preparing for a journey that will carry it across oceans, where its meaning will begin to fracture and transform once again. The imperial city fades behind you, like a heavy curtain being slowly drawn closed, not disappearing, but losing dominance over your attention as something unfamiliar begins to press in from the edges of perception. The air feels different now, less ceremonial, less controlled, more uncertain. You sense transition before you see it. Cacao is still present, but its meaning is about to be tested by an entirely new worldview. You find yourself near a coastal point of arrival, where movement is no longer contained within a single cultural system. Ships appear on the horizon like floating structures of intent. The shoreline is active with loading, unloading and cautious observation. Everything feels provisional, as if both sides of this encounter are still deciding what the other represents. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that Spanish explorers and colonizers encountered cacao during their early contact with Mesoamerican civilizations and initially found its taste unfamiliar, even unsettling, before gradually recognizing its economic and cultural significance. You observe this moment not as a single event, but as a slow unfolding of confusion and curiosity. You stand at the edge of interaction between two worlds that do not yet share a vocabulary. Cacao is offered, exchanged, and observed with hesitation. The reaction is not immediate appreciation. Instead, there is analysis. Europeans try to interpret it through their own sensory and culinary expectations, searching for familiar reference points that do not yet exist. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that early descriptions of cacao varied widely among European observers, with some emphasizing its bitterness and others focusing on its perceived medicinal or stimulating qualities, revealing how perception shaped early interpretation more than consistency of experience. You begin to see how first contact is never neutral. The air near the port feels tense but not hostile. It is filled with negotiation rather than conflict. Language barriers force communication through objects, gestures, and demonstration. Cacao becomes one of those objects, a physical explanation where words fail. You watch as cacao beans are displayed and examined. Their unfamiliar form draws attention. They are small, uneven, and unassuming, yet clearly valued by those presenting them. The Europeans try to understand this contradiction. Why would something so simple carry such significance? A historical interpretation often highlighted in economic studies notes that European powers quickly began to recognize cacao not just as a curiosity, but as a potential commodity that could be integrated into emerging global trade networks, especially when combined with sugar and other imported goods. You notice how perception shifts when economic possibility enters the frame. The exchange process begins to formalize. Cacao is no longer only a cultural artifact. It becomes a point of negotiation. Prices are discussed. Quantities are estimated. Value begins to be translated into new systems of measurement that do not yet fully align. You observe the subtle imbalance in understanding. One side sees cacao as embedded in ritual, currency, and social structure. The other begins to see it as a resource to be extracted, processed, and standardized. This divergence will shape everything that follows. A quirky historical detail recorded in some early travel accounts describes Europeans experimenting with cacao preparation methods by adding unfamiliar ingredients, attempting to align it with familiar tastes, often with inconsistent and surprising results that revealed how adaptable yet unstable its identity could become in new environments. You can almost sense the trial and error unfolding. On the shoreline, goods are reorganized. Cacao is bundled differently, stored differently, and prepared for transport across water. Its journey is about to expand beyond regional systems into something far larger. The scale of movement is no longer local or imperial, it's becoming global. A widely recognized historical fact is that cacao was transported across the Atlantic by Spanish traders, marking the beginning of its integration into European markets and the early stages of its transformation into a global commodity. You feel the weight of this shift, even before it fully happens. You step onto a vessel, or perhaps simply observe it closely enough to feel its structure. It is crowded with goods, materials, and expectations. Cacao is stored among other valuable items, no longer isolated as a cultural substance but integrated into a broader system of trade. Historians still debate whether cacao's adoption in Europe was driven primarily by elite demand for exotic luxury goods or by early medicinal associations that framed it as a health-supporting substance before its culinary transformation. Standing in this transitional moment, you can see both interpretations forming at once. The sea becomes the dominant presence now. Movement is slow but constant. The horizon feels endless. Cacao, once rooted in forest and empire, is now suspended between continents. Its identity is no longer anchored to a single culture. It is becoming portable in meaning as well as form. A lesser-known maritime observation notes that early transatlantic shipments often faced challenges in preserving cacao quality during long voyages, leading to adaptations in storage methods and handling practices that influenced how it would later be processed in Europe. You begin to understand how logistics shape taste. You imagine the confusion upon arrival in European ports. A substance deeply embedded in ritual and economy is now entering societies that have no shared framework for its original meaning. Translation becomes incomplete. Something is always lost or reshaped in the process. A scholarly interpretation frequently discussed in cultural history emphasizes that cacao's transformation in Europe marked not just a culinary shift but a cognitive one, where meaning was gradually detached from origin and rebuilt through new cultural assumptions. You feel this detachment beginning to form. As the ship continues forward, cacao becomes quieter in symbolic terms. It is no longer surrounded by ritual language or tribute systems. Instead, it is surrounded by anticipation. What will it become in this new world? You watch the coastline slowly recede. The old systems remain behind. Still functioning, still meaningful, but now separated by distance. Cacao is entering a phase where its identity will be rewritten repeatedly, shaped by new hands, new desires, and new economies. And ahead beyond the sea, a different kind of transformation is already waiting, where cacao will begin to sweeten, soften, and change its form entirely. The ocean stretches out in every direction now, and the land you once stood on feels increasingly distant, not only physically but conceptually, as if it belongs to a different version of reality that is slowly being left behind. The ship moves with steady persistence, and cacao, once rooted in forests, markets, and empires, now exists in a new condition. It is no longer embedded in familiar social systems, it is in transit, suspended between meanings. You stand among cargo and sailors, listening to the rhythm of the vessel. Wood creaks softly under shifting weight. Water presses against the hull in a repetitive motion that feels almost like breathing. Everything is in motion, yet nothing feels rushed. Cacao is stored in containers that now serve a different purpose. It is no longer currency or ritual offering. It is inventory, expectation, and possibility. A widely recognized historical fact is that cacao was brought to Europe through Spanish maritime trade routes during the early colonial period, where it initially circulated among elites before gradually spreading into broader consumption. You watch this transition begin in its earliest, most uncertain form. Nothing is stable yet. Everything is being reinterpreted. On board, cacao is handled carefully, but not reverently in the old sense. The reverence has changed shape. It is now tied to preservation, transport, and anticipated value. The question is no longer what cacao means in its original context, but what it can become when removed from that context entirely. You notice how sailors treat it with curiosity rather than ceremony. They are aware it is valuable, but they do not yet fully understand why. Some taste it in crude preparations, mixing it with whatever ingredients are available. The results are inconsistent, sometimes bitter, sometimes strangely comforting, depending on how it is altered. A lesser-known maritime observation suggests that early transatlantic shipments often experimented informally with cacao preparation during voyages, as limited supplies and long travel times encouraged improvisation that would later influence European methods of consumption. You see how necessity quietly shapes culture even before intention does. The air on the ship feels different from land. It carries salt, wood, and stored goods. Cacao is no longer surrounded by forest humidity or market activity. It exists in isolation, which changes how it is perceived. Without its original context, its identity becomes more flexible, more open to reinterpretation. You imagine the approaching ports of Europe, even before they appear. Cities that will encounter cacao not as a sacred drink or currency, but as a foreign substance requiring explanation. This gap in understanding will become the foundation for transformation. A widely acknowledged historical interpretation is that cacao's introduction into Europe initially positioned it as an exotic luxury consumed by aristocratic circles, often prepared in ways that reflected European tastes rather than its original Mesoamerican forms. You can already sense this reinterpretation forming, like a second identity layered over the first. As the ship continues forward, you observe how cacao is gradually stripped of its original associations. No tribute systems accompany it here. No ritual frameworks define its use. Instead, it becomes something that must be redefined through experimentation. It is not yet chocolate. It is still cacao, but increasingly unnamed in its future form. You watch sailors speak about it in fragmented ways. Some focus on its taste, others on its potential value, others on its unfamiliar texture when processed. There is no unified understanding. Instead, there are multiple interpretations competing quietly within the same space. A quirky historical detail recorded in early European accounts describes cacao as being initially prepared with spices and sweeteners unfamiliar to Mesoamerican tradition, creating hybrid drinks that reflected both curiosity and adaptation rather than faithful reproduction. You notice how cultural translation always alters substance. The horizon begins to feel closer, though it is still distant. The ship carries not only goods but also expectations that are not yet fully formed. Cacao is part of that expectation. It is something waiting to be understood, refined and integrated into systems that do not yet exist. Historians still argue whether cacao's early European adoption was driven more by medical framing, where it was believed to have health properties, or by elite culinary experimentation that gradually established its reputation as a luxury beverage. You can see both impulses forming simultaneously, like two paths diverging from the same origin. You imagine the first cups prepared in European settings. Thick, unfamiliar, heavily modified. The bitterness remains, but it is softened, adjusted, and reframed. Sugar begins to enter the story more prominently now, not just as an addition, but as a transformation agent that changes identity itself. A lesser-known economic observation suggests that the addition of sugar to cacao in European contexts has significantly altered its accessibility and desirability, contributing to its eventual spread beyond aristocratic circles into broader consumer markets. You begin to understand how one ingredient can reshape an entire trajectory. On the ship, time feels extended, days are repetitive, marked by weather, movement, and maintenance. Cacao remains stable in storage, yet unstable in meaning. It is waiting for interpretation, waiting for integration into systems that will assign it new cultural weight. You think about how many identities cacao has already carried. Sacred drink, ritual offering, currency, tribute, commodity. Each transformation does not erase the previous one. Instead, it layers over it, creating complexity that will never fully disappear. A widely recognized historical fact is that cacao eventually became a foundational element in European chocolate culture, evolving from a bitter, imported beverage into a widely consumed sweetened drink that spread across social classes over time. You're witnessing the very beginning of that evolution. As land finally appears on the horizon, the energy on the ship shifts slightly. Movement becomes more purposeful, preparations for arrival begin, cacao is checked, organized, and prepared for distribution into a system that will interpret it in entirely new ways. A scholarly interpretation often highlighted in cultural trade history emphasizes that the transformation of cacao in Europe represents one of the clearest examples of how commodities are reshaped not only by economics but by cultural preference, technological adaptation, and shifting social meaning. You feel this transformation beginning to accelerate. The ship approaches port. Structures become visible. Activity increases. Cacao is no longer just travelling. It is about to be reintroduced into a world that will redefine it completely. And beyond this arrival, beyond this first contact with European soil, cacao's identity is already beginning to split into new directions that will reshape global taste, economy, and desire. The ship settles into port with a slow finality, as if the ocean itself is reluctant to release what it has carried across such distance. The creaking of wood softens into stillness. Ropes tighten. Voices rise again, clearer now, shaped by a different language, a different rhythm of life. Cacao is no longer at sea. It has arrived. But arrival here does not mean completion. It means redefinition. You step onto European ground where the air feels drier, less saturated, almost sharper in its contrast to the humid worlds you have left behind. Everything looks structured differently. Streets are narrower, stone replaces earth in many places, and movement feels more segmented. Cacao is here now, but it does not belong here yet. It is being observed, measured, and cautiously accepted. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate was initially consumed in Europe as a beverage among elite social classes, often prepared with sugar and spices to suit European palates rather than its original, bitter Mesoamerican form. You watch this transformation begin in quiet rooms where curiosity outweighs tradition. Inside a grand residence, you see cacao being prepared with careful attention. It is no longer poured with ritual foam in the same way. Instead, it is mixed, sweetened, and adjusted. The goal is not to preserve its original identity, but to make it compatible with new expectations of taste and comfort. You notice how different spaces react differently to the same substance. In aristocratic salons, cacao is treated as refined luxury. In private chambers, it becomes a personal indulgence. In religious spaces, it is sometimes viewed with suspicion or moral debate. Its identity is unstable, shaped entirely by context. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that early European chocolate preparation often involved experimentation with ingredients such as vanilla, cinnamon, and sugar, leading to regional variations that reflected local taste preferences rather than any standardized tradition. You begin to see how quickly adaptation begins when a substance enters a new cultural environment. You move through a quiet corridor where servants carry trays carefully balanced with cups of thick, aromatic drink. The scent is different here, heavier in sweetness, softer in bitterness. The foam of earlier worlds is less visible, replaced by smooth surfaces that reflect light in a more uniform way. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that chocolate became associated with aristocratic and courtly culture in early modern Europe, particularly in Spain and later France and Italy, where it was integrated into rituals of hospitality and social display. You observe how consumption itself becomes performance. In a royal setting, cacao is no longer just consumed, it is presented. The act of drinking becomes part of social choreography. Cups are held in specific ways, conversations pause and resume around it. Chocolate becomes part of etiquette, a marker of refinement and distinction. You notice how silence functions differently here. It is not the contemplative silence of ritual forests or the structured silence of imperial tribute halls. It is a conversational silence, filled with anticipation and subtle observation. Chocolate sits within it like a shared signal. A quirky historical detail recorded in early European accounts describes how Chocolate drinking vessels were sometimes specially designed with lids or handles to accommodate its thick consistency. Reflecting how physical design evolved in response to a newly introduced substance, you see how tools change alongside taste. Historians still argue whether chocolate's popularity in early Europe was driven more by genuine appreciation of its flavour or by its association with luxury and novelty, making it desirable precisely because it was unfamiliar and exclusive. Standing here, you see both forces at work simultaneously. You enter a convent kitchen where chocolate is being prepared in a different tone entirely. Here, it is quieter, more reflective. The atmosphere is structured around routine and discipline. Chocolate becomes part of daily life in a controlled environment, separate from aristocratic display but still deeply meaningful. A lesser-known cultural observation suggests that religious communities played a significant role in refining chocolate preparation techniques, especially in regions where fasting practices allowed for creative interpretations of permissible consumption. You begin to understand how adaptation spreads across unexpected spaces. The drink is stirred slowly. Heat rises gently. The aroma fills the room without overwhelming it. You notice how chocolate is becoming less about its origin and more about its method of preparation. Identity is shifting from place to process. You walk through a European street where small shops begin to appear selling prepared chocolate drinks. It is still relatively rare, still somewhat expensive, but no longer confined exclusively to courts and religious spaces. A gradual expansion is underway. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate houses eventually emerged in parts of Europe, functioning as social and intellectual gathering spaces similar to coffee houses, where people met to discuss politics, business, and culture over shared beverages. You begin to sense the social expansion of cacao's legacy. Inside one such early gathering space, conversation is lively but controlled. Chocolate is served in cups that emphasize its richness. People speak of trade, news, and ideas. The drink becomes a medium for communication as much as consumption. A quirky historical note suggests that early chocolate houses sometimes developed reputations tied to specific regions or clientele, with subtle differences in preparation and atmosphere that reflected local culture and social hierarchy. You notice how even shared substances fragment into local identities. You observe how chocolate begins to influence daily rhythm. Morning, afternoon, and evening, consumption patterns emerge in different ways depending on social class and location. It is no longer a rare import. It is becoming a habit. Historians still debate whether chocolate's early spread across Europe was primarily driven by elite imitation patterns or by broader economic accessibility as production and import systems became more efficient over time. You see both processes unfolding gradually, overlapping without clear separation. You pause in a quiet moment, noticing how far cacao has travelled already, from forest rituals to imperial tribute, from currency to ocean cargo, and now into European refinement. Each stage has not erased the previous one. Instead, it has layered meaning upon meaning. A widely acknowledged historical interpretation emphasizes that chocolate's transformation in Europe represents a cultural recontextualization, where a substance is continuously redefined through new social, economic, and sensory frameworks. You feel this redefinition continuing even now, as you leave the grand interior spaces and return toward the street. You sense that chocolate is no longer just arriving in Europe. It is beginning to belong here in a new form. But this belonging is not still. It is still evolving, still uncertain, and ahead. Beyond these early cups and courtly rooms, chocolate is preparing to change again, this time through industry, technology, and scale that will reshape it far beyond anything this world has yet imagined. The refined interiors of Europe begin to recede behind you, not abruptly, but as a gradual loosening of structure. As if the rooms themselves are dissolving back into the wider currents of time, the scent of early chocolate still lingers in memory, thick with sweetness and novelty. But now you find yourself moving towards something broader, less contained. Chocolate is no longer confined to courts, convents, or salons. It is beginning to shift into circulation. You notice the change in scale first. Streets feel busier, trade routes more active, and commercial energy more visible in everyday life. Chocolate is no longer an exclusive performance of aristocratic identity. It is becoming a commodity that responds to supply, demand, and innovation. The substance itself remains the same in origin, yet everything around it is being reorganized. A widely accepted historical fact is that the addition of sugar to cacao in Europe fundamentally transformed chocolate from a bitter ceremonial drink into a sweetened beverage that appealed to a much wider audience across social classes. You can almost feel that transformation happening in real time, as taste itself becomes something engineered rather than inherited. You walk through spaces where ingredients are discussed with increasing precision. Sugar is no longer just an additive, it is a defining force. It reshapes bitterness into pleasure, intensity into comfort, and unfamiliarity into familiarity. Chocolate begins to lose its sharp edges and acquire a smoother identity that travels more easily between households. You observe workshops where chocolate is prepared in larger quantities. The process is becoming less ceremonial and more procedural. Grinding, mixing, heating, and shaping are beginning to follow repeatable methods. This is not yet industrial production, but the logic of standardization is quietly taking root. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that early European chocolate preparation varied significantly by the region, with local adaptations producing distinct textures and flavors that reflected available resources and evolving cultural preferences rather than any unified recipe tradition. You notice how diversity exists even within growing uniformity. In small urban homes, chocolate appears in morning routines. In wealthier households, it remains a symbol of refinement. In commercial settings, it becomes a product to be sold rather than simply consumed. Each environment shapes it differently, and yet it continues to hold a recognizable identity across all of them. You pass by markets where goods are increasingly categorized. Chocolate is displayed alongside spices, imported goods, and luxury items. It is still exotic in some contexts, but no longer incomprehensible. People now speak of it with expectation rather than confusion. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate consumption spread beyond elite circles in Europe over time as production methods improved and trade networks expanded, gradually making it more accessible to middle-class consumers. You see this diffusion reflected in the subtle changes of everyday life around you. You enter a space where chocolate is being discussed not as a novelty, but as part of domestic culture. Recipes are exchanged, preparation techniques are refined. There is growing attention to consistency, flavor balance, and texture. Chocolate is becoming something that can be improved, not just experienced. A quirky historical detail from early culinary records notes that some European households experimented with thickening agents and emulsification techniques in chocolate preparation, attempting to control its texture and stability in ways that would eventually influence later confectionery development. You begin to see experimentation as a quiet driver of change. The air in these spaces feels warmer, not physically but socially. Chocolate is associated with comfort, conversation, and shared moments. It is no longer strictly tied to status. It is becoming part of routine human interaction. You notice how language around chocolate changes. Words that once described rarity now describe quality. Terms that once implied exotic origin now imply refinement or craftsmanship. Meaning is slowly detaching from geography and attaching instead to method and taste. A different strand of historical interpretation emphasizes that chocolate's transition into everyday European life was closely linked to broader shifts in global trade, technological refinement, and changing social structures that allowed imported goods to become integrated into domestic economies. You feel this integration happening in layers. You pass through a bustling commercial district where early forms of specialty shops begin to emerge. Chocolate is prepared on demand, sometimes thick, sometimes diluted, sometimes mixed with spices or sweeteners depending on customer preference. Choice itself becomes part of the experience. A lesser-known observation suggests that early vendors often adjusted chocolate recipes informally based on customer feedback, creating a dynamic relationship between producer and consumer that contributed to the diversification of chocolate styles across regions. You notice how adaptation spreads through interaction rather than design. Inside these spaces, chocolate is no longer just consumed, it is discussed. People compare preparation styles, share opinions, and develop preferences. Consumption becomes reflective, almost analytical in certain circles. Historians still argue whether chocolate's rapid cultural expansion in Europe was primarily driven by elite imitation patterns that diffused downward through society, or by early commercialization that made it accessible across broader economic groups from the beginning. You can see both processes unfolding together, overlapping without clear separation. You pause in a quieter moment and notice how far chocolate has travelled in meaning alone. It has moved from sacred forests to imperial systems, from tribute economies to aristocratic salons, and now into emerging commercial life. Each stage has not erased the previous one, but layered over it. A widely recognized historical interpretation suggests that chocolate's evolution in Europe reflects a broader pattern of cultural adaptation, where imported substances are continuously reshaped by local taste, technology, and social structure until they become fully integrated into everyday life. You see this process accelerating around you as evening light begins to soften the streets. Chocolate is no longer just a luxury or curiosity, it is becoming part of rhythm, a drink that can accompany thought, conversation, or quiet rest. Its identity is no longer singular, it is plural, shifting and expanding. And beyond these early commercial streets, chocolate is already preparing for its next transformation, one that will remove it further from its origins and embed it deeply into the machinery of modern production and global desire. The early commercial streets of Europe begin to dissolve behind you, replaced by a louder, denser kind of social energy that feels less like quiet evolution and more like acceleration. The rhythm of daily life is no longer confined to households or small workshops. It spills outward into public spaces where ideas, money, and taste circulate with increasing speed. Chocolate, once a rare imported curiosity, now enters this expanding social world as something far more dynamic. You find yourself stepping into what feels like a new kind of urban environment, not modern in your sense, but distinctly more social, more conversational, more outward-facing than the spaces you have seen before. People gather not only to consume chocolate, but to discuss it, trade it, and build relationships around it. It is becoming part of public life. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate houses emerged in several European cities during the 17th and 18th centuries, functioning as social venues where people gathered to drink chocolate while engaging in conversation, commerce, and political discussion. You enter one of these spaces and immediately feel the difference. It is alive with sound, yet structured in its own way. Inside, tables are arranged closely but not chaotically. Conversations overlap but do not collapse into noise. Chocolate is served in thick cups, darker and more aromatic than earlier versions, yet still clearly distinct from modern interpretations. The drink anchors the room, giving people a shared point of focus. You notice how chocolate here is not simply consumed. It organizes interaction. People arrive, order, sit, and begin speaking with a rhythm that feels almost rehearsed. News is exchanged, opinions are formed, decisions, sometimes informal and sometimes consequential, begin to take shape over shared cups. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that chocolate houses often develop distinct cultural identities depending on their clientele, with some becoming centres of political discussion while others lean toward commerce, literature, or social networking. You begin to see how space itself is shaped by what is consumed within it. The air is warm and dense with layered aromas. Chocolate, wood, tobacco, paper, and human presence all blend together into a single sensory environment. It is not overwhelming, but it is continuous. You realize that chocolate here is not isolated as a product. It is embedded in atmosphere. You sit for a moment and observe how people interact. Conversations are not random. They are structured around shared references. Chocolate becomes a conversational anchor, a reason for gathering that allows other topics to emerge naturally. Trade routes, financial speculation, literature, and rumours of distant events all flow through this shared space. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that chocolate houses in some European cities became important centres of social and political life, sometimes serving as informal spaces where news and ideas circulated among merchants, writers, and thinkers before reaching formal institutions. You can sense this informational function in the way people seek and listen. You notice that chocolate preparation is becoming more standardized in these environments. The drink is thicker, smoother, and more consistent than in earlier periods. This reflects growing knowledge of ingredients, proportions, and preparation techniques that are gradually stabilizing across regions. A quirky historical detail from early accounts notes that some chocolate houses were known for specific preparation styles or ingredient combinations that became part of their identity, almost like early branding. Even before formal commercial branding systems existed, you observe how reputation begins to form around taste itself. The seating area around you feels both public and intimate. People are surrounded by others, yet conversations feel personal. Chocolate creates a kind of shared boundary where strangers become temporarily connected through the act of drinking the same substance. You begin to understand how chocolate is shaping not only taste but social behaviour. It encourages staying longer, speaking more, listening more carefully. It slows down time in a space that is otherwise defined by information exchange and economic activity. A different strand of historical interpretation emphasizes that chocolate houses contributed to the development of modern public discourse by creating semi-open environments where private individuals could gather outside formal institutions and engage in discussion about shared concerns. You feel this transitional quality strongly. Outside the windows, the city continues its movement. Inside, time feels slightly suspended. The contrast between exterior motion and interior conversation creates a layered sense of reality. Chocolate sits at the centre of this contrast, grounding attention. You notice how language around chocolate becomes increasingly descriptive. People talk about quality, richness, preparation, and origin in more nuanced ways. It is no longer enough to simply consume it. It must be evaluated, compared, and discussed. A lesser-known culinary observation suggests that variations in chocolate preparation across different regions of Europe during this period contributed to early forms of taste preference development, where consumers began to associate specific textures and flavours with particular social environments. You see how preference itself becomes cultural. In one corner of the room, a group is engaged in animated discussion. Their conversation shifts between commerce and politics, with chocolate acting as a constant presence rather than the focus itself. It is the medium that allows other topics to surface. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate, along with coffee and tea, became part of a broader transformation in European drinking culture during the early modern period. where stimulating beverages played a growing role in social interaction and daily routine. You can sense this broader shift unfolding around you. You observe how chocolate is served repeatedly, not as a one-time experience, but as part of ongoing consumption. Cups are refilled, conversations continue, and people remain in place for extended periods. The act of drinking becomes continuous rather than episodic. A quirky tidbit from early travel descriptions notes that some visitors to chocolate houses were surprised by the intensity of conversation and the density of information exchange, describing these spaces as both social and intellectual environments unlike traditional dining settings. You notice how novelty shapes perception. As you move through the room, you begin to recognize subtle hierarchies. Seating positions, speaking styles, and even drinking habits reflect social differences, though less rigid than formal court structures. Chocolate participates in these distinctions without defining them completely. Historians still argue whether chocolate houses played a more significant role in fostering economic innovation through merchant networking, or in shaping cultural and intellectual discourse through informal communication channels. Standing here, you see both functions merging seamlessly. The environment feels like a living system of exchange, where ideas and goods circulate together. Chocolate is not just a beverage, it is part of a communication infrastructure that supports human interaction at multiple levels. You take a final look around the room. Nothing dramatic occurs. There is no clear climax. Instead, there is continuity. Conversations rise and fall. Cups are filled and emptied. Time passes in a steady rhythm. And beyond this room, beyond these early public spaces of discussion and taste, chocolate is already preparing to enter a new phase where technology, industry, and global demand will begin to reshape it once again. You leave the lively haze of chocolate houses behind, and the shift this time is less about location and more about mindset. The world feels more analytical now, as if people have begun to interrogate what chocolate is doing to them, rather than simply enjoying it. The atmosphere changes from social warmth to cautious curiosity. Chocolate is no longer just a shared beverage. It has become a subject of debate, suspicion, and fascination all at once. You find yourself in quieter interiors where conversation is slower and more deliberate. The drink is still present, but it is accompanied by questions. What does it do to the body? How does it affect the mind? When should it be consumed? And who should have access to it? Chocolate has moved into a space where pleasure is no longer its only meaning. A widely recognized historical fact is that in early modern Europe, chocolate was often discussed not only as a luxury food, but also as a substance with perceived medicinal properties, believed by some physicians and thinkers to influence digestion, energy, and general well-being. You notice how easily food becomes theory when science and tradition overlap. In one room, you observe a gathering of educated individuals examining chocolate with careful attention. They speak in measured tones, considering its effects on warmth, vitality, and bodily balance. The drink is no longer just tasted, it is evaluated, categorized, and interpreted through emerging frameworks of knowledge. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that some early medical texts describe chocolate in conflicting ways, simultaneously praising its restorative qualities while warning about potential overindulgence, reflecting an unsettled understanding of its physiological impact. You begin to see how uncertainty creates complexity in interpretation. Chocolate here is not stable in meaning, it shifts depending on who is speaking. Physicians describe it one way, merchants another, consumers another. Each perspective adds a layer rather than replacing the others. The result is a substance surrounded by competing explanations. You notice how preparation becomes part of the discussion. Temperature, thickness, additives, and timing are all considered relevant. Even small changes in preparation are believed to influence outcome. chocolate is treated less as a fixed product and more as a modifiable experience. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that chocolate, during this period, was often consumed in different forms across Europe, sometimes thick and rich, sometimes diluted, sometimes combined with spices or sweeteners, depending on local customs and beliefs about health and taste. You can see this diversity reflected in every cup you encounter. You sit in a quieter chamber where conversation turns toward restraint. There is discussion about how much chocolate is appropriate, when it should be consumed, and whether it should be part of daily life or reserved for specific moments. Pleasure is being negotiated rather than assumed. A quirky historical detail from early accounts notes that chocolate was sometimes recommended or restricted based on seasonal or personal conditions, with advice varying widely between practitioners, creating a patchwork of guidance that reflected the lack of standardized medical consensus. You notice how knowledge itself is still forming. The room feels slightly heavier with reflection. Chocolate is still enjoyed, but it is no longer innocent in perception. People are aware of its stimulation, its richness, and its potential to affect mood and energy. Enjoyment is now accompanied by interpretation. You move through discussions where morality enters the conversation. Some voices suggest moderation, others emphasize benefit, and others question whether such indulgence aligns with discipline or restraint. Chocolate becomes a mirror for broader cultural concerns about pleasure and control. A different strand of historical interpretation emphasizes that debates about chocolate in early modern Europe were not solely about health, but also about broader anxieties regarding luxury consumption and changing social habits. You begin to see chocolate as a focal point for larger cultural tensions. You notice how language shifts again. Words like excess, balance, warmth, and nourishment appear frequently. Chocolate is no longer just described in sensory terms, it is described in conceptual terms, as if people are trying to locate its proper place in human life. In another setting, you observe chocolate being prepared with careful measurement. Ingredients are no longer added intuitively, but with reference to proportion and consistency. This marks a quiet transition towards standardization, even if not yet fully formalized. A lesser-known culinary observation suggests that early chocolate preparation manuals began to emerge in Europe, offering structured guidance on ingredients and methods, indicating an early attempt to codify what had previously been flexible and regionally variable practice. You see knowledge becoming written rather than purely oral. You watch as individuals test different versions of the drink. Some are richer, some lighter, some more spiced. Reactions are noted carefully. Preference begins to become something observable rather than purely subjective. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate's reputation in Europe was shaped not only by taste, but also by its association with vitality and stimulation, contributing to its positioning alongside other popular beverages of the time. You can sense how comparison shapes identity. The environment around you feels increasingly structured around inquiry. Chocolate is not only consumed or shared, it is analyzed. People want to understand it, define it, and control its effects. This desire for understanding begins to shape how it is produced. A quirky tidbit from early writings suggests that some observers believe chocolate could influence temperament or emotional balance, leading to discussions about its role in daily routine and personal discipline. You notice how interpretation often blends observation with assumption. You step outside briefly and notice how the broader world continues its movement unaffected by these debates. Yet within these enclosed spaces, chocolate occupies significant intellectual space. It becomes a site where culture, health, and morality intersect. Historians still argue whether early European debates about chocolate were primarily driven by genuine medical uncertainty, or whether they reflected broader cultural attempts to regulate luxury consumption in changing economic conditions. You see both forces shaping the discourse simultaneously. As you return inside, you realize that chocolate has now fully entered the realm of interpretation. It is no longer just a substance that travels, tastes, or circulates. It is something that must be explained. And beyond these discussions, beyond this layered questioning of pleasure and restraint, chocolate is already moving toward a new phase where explanation will give way to efficiency. Scale, a mechanical transformation. You leave behind the rooms of debate and measured consumption, and the atmosphere shifts again, this time in a way that feels less intellectual and more grounded in physical reality. The air is heavier, more labour-focused, and the world around you no longer centres on questions of meaning or health. Instead, it centres on production, extraction, and the invisible systems that make comfort possible elsewhere. You find yourself moving toward landscapes that feel increasingly distant from the polished interiors of Europe. The streets thin, the architecture becomes more functional, and the presence of organised movement grows stronger. Chocolate is still part of this world. But its story is no longer confined to cups and conversation. It's now tied to supply chains that stretch far beyond what is visible here. A widely recognised historical fact is that European demand for chocolate, along with other colonial commodities such as sugar and coffee, was deeply connected to plantation economies established in colonised regions, where large-scale agricultural production supplied raw materials to European markets. You begin to feel the distance between consumption and origin expand into something almost unsettling. You are no longer looking at chocolate as a finished experience, you're tracing it backward, toward its origin in systems of cultivation and labour. The sweetness that once felt soft and comforting now carries the weight of distant fields and organised extraction. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that early colonial plantation systems were often structured around maximising yield efficiency through strict labour organisation, crop specialisation, and controlled processing methods, which reshaped both landscapes and local economies over time. You notice how production itself becomes a form of landscape transformation. The imagery around you changes. You are now in spaces that feel less like cities and more like controlled agricultural zones. Rows of crops extend outward with deliberate order. Movement is purposeful, repetitive, and continuous. Chocolate begins to lose its association with luxury and begins to reveal its dependence on scale. You observe how cacao is handled at the source level. The process is physical, demanding, and repetitive. Pods are collected, opened, and processed in cycles that require sustained human effort. Nothing here feels decorative. Everything is functional. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that cacao cultivation expanded significantly under colonial systems, particularly in tropical regions where environmental conditions allowed large-scale production for export to European markets. You begin to understand how geography and economy become tightly intertwined. You notice how labour shapes the rhythm of this environment. Work is not episodic, it is continuous. The value of cacao in distant cities depends on this uninterrupted cycle of cultivation and processing. The connection between cup and field becomes clearer and more complex. A quirky historical detail from early colonial records suggests that cacao cultivation techniques were often adapted from existing local agricultural knowledge. Even as European demand imposed new constraints and expectations on production systems, you see how knowledge flows in multiple directions, even within unequal structures. The air here feels different again. It carries the scent of earth, vegetation, and heat. There is no refinement, no cushioning. Chocolate, as it will later be known in European contexts, begins here in a form that is far removed from sweetness. It is raw, physical, and embedded in environment. You watch the movement of goods from cultivation to preparation. The transformation is gradual but constant. Nothing becomes chocolate instantly. It passes through stages of drying, fermentation, and transport. Each stage adds distance from origin and closeness to consumption. A widely recognized historical fact is that colonial trade networks were essential in linking agricultural production zones in the Americas, Africa, and Asia to European consumer markets, creating global systems of exchange that reshaped economies and diets. You begin to see chocolate as part of a much larger global structure. You notice how administrative control overlays physical labor. Records are kept, quantities are measured, expectations are enforced. The plant itself becomes part of a system that extends far beyond its natural environment. A lesser-known historical observation suggests that plantation economies often relied on complex logistical coordination, including transportation routes, storage systems, and processing centers, which allowed raw agricultural products to be efficiently converted into export commodities. You begin to understand how infrastructure quietly defines possibility. You move through spaces where cacao is prepared for shipment. The process is no longer about taste or ritual. It is about durability, consistency, and volume. The goal is to preserve material value across long distances. The human presence here is constant but often backgrounded by process. Work happens in repetition. Movement follows necessity. Chocolate is no longer a drink in this context. It is a material in transition. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts notes that early shipments of cacao sometimes faced quality variations during long transport, leading to adjustments in drying and storage practices that gradually standardize processing methods across different production regions. You notice how global systems refine themselves through repetition. The landscape begins to feel like a network rather than a place. Fields connect to storage connects to transport connects to distant consumption. Chocolate exists as a thread moving through this network, invisible in its final form but essential in its continuity. Historians still argue whether colonial plantation systems were primarily driven by economic efficiency alone, or whether they were shaped equally by political control and global competition among emerging European powers. Standing here, you can feel both forces embedded in the structure around you. You pause for a moment and realize that chocolate, which once seemed like a sensory experience, has now expanded into a global system of movement and transformation. Its identity is no longer confined to taste, culture, or ritual. It is embedded in geography, labor, and exchange. And beyond this structured world of production and movement, chocolate is already beginning to shift again, preparing to enter an era where machines, factories, and industrial logic will reshape it once more. The plantation landscapes begin to blur behind you, not through disappearance, but through transformation into something more mechanical in feeling, as if the natural world is being gradually rewritten into patterns of repetition and precision. The air shifts again. It feels less like soil and vegetation, and more like energy in motion, directed and controlled. Chocolate is about to enter a new identity, one defined not by fields or ships, but by machines. You find yourself inside an early industrial environment where sound becomes the dominant force. There is a steady rhythm of mechanical motion, grinding, pressing, and rotating. It is not chaotic, but it is constant. Unlike the organic rhythms of forests or markets, this rhythm does not pause for seasons or ceremony. It continues regardless of time. A widely recognized historical fact is that the Industrial Revolution fundamentally transformed chocolate production through the introduction of mechanized processes such as grinding, pressing, and mass refining, which allowed cacao to be processed at a scale previously impossible. You begin to see how chocolate is no longer shaped primarily by human hands alone. You walk through a space where large mechanical systems process cacao into finer, more consistent forms. The transformation is visible and audible. What once required careful manual labor is now distributed across machines that standardize texture and output. The result is less variation, more predictability. You notice how the material itself changes under this system. Cacao becomes smoother, more uniform, easier to combine with other ingredients. The roughness of earlier forms is gradually reduced. Chocolate is being engineered toward consistency. A lesser-known industrial observation suggests that early mechanized chocolate production often emerged alongside innovations in steam power and hydraulic systems, allowing manufacturers to separate cocoa solids from cocoa butter more efficiently than traditional manual methods. You see how technological systems quietly reshape sensory experience. The environment feels structured around efficiency. Movement is optimized. Materials flow along predetermined paths. Nothing is left to chance. Even human labor is organized into specific roles that contribute to a larger production sequence. You observe workers overseeing machines rather than performing every step manually. Their role is increasingly supervisory. They monitor, adjust, and maintain rather than directly transform. Chocolate production is becoming less about craft and more about system control. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that mechanization in chocolate production enabled significantly larger quantities of cacao to be processed and distributed, contributing to its transition from a luxury product into a widely accessible consumer good. You begin to understand how scale changes meaning. The sound of grinding becomes almost rhythmic, like an industrial heartbeat. It is repetitive but not chaotic. Over time, it begins to feel almost natural within this environment, as if the world itself has adapted to mechanical cadence. You notice how the texture of chocolate changes as it moves through different stages of processing. It becomes finer, more fluid, more adaptable. The sensory identity of chocolate is being redesigned through engineering rather than tradition. A quirky historical detail from early industrial records notes that some of the first large-scale chocolate processing facilities experimented with combining cocoa solids and cocoa butter in controlled proportions, leading to the early development of smoother, more stable chocolate products. You can sense how experimentation drives standardization. The air carries a faint sweetness now, but it is controlled sweetness. Not the raw or ceremonial versions you have seen before. It is measured, predictable, and repeatable. Chocolate is becoming something that can be reproduced with precision. You move deeper into the production space and observe how chocolate begins to take on different physical forms. It is no longer only a beverage. It is being shaped into blocks, powders, and eventually solid forms that can be stored and transported easily. A widely recognized historical fact is that the invention of cocoa press technology in the 19th century allowed for the separation of cocoa butter from cocoa solids, which significantly expanded the versatility of chocolate in both culinary and industrial applications. You realize this separation is a turning point in identity. The process of separation changes everything. Once divided, each component can be recombined in new ways. Chocolate becomes modular. It can be adjusted, reshaped, and reformulated depending on desired outcome. You observe how packaging begins to appear as part of the system. Chocolate is no longer just produced, it is contained, labeled, and prepared for distribution. The concept of uniformity becomes essential. A lesser-known industrial observation suggests that early packaging innovations played a crucial role in extending chocolate's shelf life and enabling long-distance distribution, which further integrated it into global consumer markets. You begin to see how preservation is part of expansion. The factory environment feels relentless but organized. There is no randomness here. Every stage has a purpose, and every motion contributes to a larger sequence. Chocolate is now fully embedded in industrial logic. You notice how taste is no longer shaped only at the moment of consumption. It is shaped at the moment of production. Machines determine texture, consistency, and even flavor balance within controlled parameters. A widely recognized historical fact is that industrialization of chocolate production played a major role in making it more affordable and widely available. fundamentally changing its position in society from elite indulgence to mass consumer product. You can feel this transition in the scale of production around you. Workers move between stations with practiced efficiency. Their labour is repetitive but essential. The system depends on continuity. Any interruption affects the entire chain. A quirky tidbit from early industrial accounts describes how manufacturers sometimes adjusted processing times and temperatures experimentally to refine texture and flavour, leading to gradual improvements in product consistency over time. You notice how small adjustments accumulate into large transformations. You step back slightly and observe the entire system as a whole. It is not just production, it is coordination across time, labour, and material. Chocolate is now part of an engineered environment where outcomes are designed rather than discovered. Historians still argue whether industrial chocolate production primarily enhanced accessibility for consumers, or whether it also contributed to the homogenization of taste across regions, reducing earlier diversity in preparation styles. Standing here, you can see both tendencies operating at once. The factory continues its steady rhythm. Nothing feels temporary. Everything is built for continuity. Chocolate flows through machines like a continuous substance being refined into uniformity. And beyond this mechanical landscape, chocolate is already preparing for its next transformation, one that will move it from industrial output into branded identity, global marketing, and cultural symbolism on an unprecedented scale. The mechanical rhythm of the factory begins to fade behind you, but not in the sense of stopping. It continues somewhere in the background of global life, like a pulse that never fully disappears once it has been established. You are now moving into a different layer of chocolate's evolution, one where production no longer feels like the defining transformation. Instead, identity itself becomes the central force. Chocolate is about to become something recognizable not only by what it is, but by how it is presented. You find yourself in a world where packaging, branding, and commercial identity begin to shape perception as strongly as taste. The substance is still chocolate, refined through industrial processes. But now it is no longer anonymous. It carries names, symbols, and visual language designed to be remembered. A widely recognized historical fact is that the late 19th century saw the emergence of solid chocolate bars and branded confectionery products, which significantly changed how chocolate was consumed, stored, and marketed to the public. You observe this transformation as objects begin to take fixed, portable forms. You see chocolate no longer flowing in liquid or semi-processed states. It now appears as structured bars, moulded shapes, and wrapped portions designed for individual consumption. This change is subtle but profound. Chocolate is becoming something that can be carried, exchanged casually, and consumed without preparation. The environment around you shifts into commercial spaces. Shops display products in organized arrangements. Colors, labels, and packaging designs compete for attention. Chocolate is no longer just a product. It is a visual identity competing in a growing marketplace of choices. A lesser-known commercial observation suggests that early branded chocolate products often relied heavily on distinctive packaging and typography to differentiate themselves in increasingly competitive markets, marking one of the early intersections between industrial production and modern advertising culture. You notice how recognition becomes part of value. You walk through a retail space where chocolate is no longer served or prepared, it is selected. People stand in front of shelves, comparing options, reading labels, and making decisions based on familiarity, reputation, and price. Consumption begins before tasting even occurs. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that the development of branded chocolate companies in Europe during the industrial era played a crucial role in transforming chocolate into a mass-market consumer good, widely accessible across different social classes. You begin to see how identity and accessibility grow together. The soundscape here is quieter than the factory but more fragmented. Conversations are brief, transactions are quick. Everything is designed for efficiency of choice rather than production. Chocolate is now part of everyday consumer decision-making. You notice how companies begin to create narratives around their products. Images of origin, quality, and tradition are used to suggest authenticity. Chocolate is no longer only defined by its ingredients, it is defined by its story. A quirky historical detail from early advertising records notes that some chocolate brands in the 19th and early 20th centuries used imagery of purity, energy, and exotic origin to appeal to consumers, blending imagination with commercial messaging in ways that shaped early marketing language. You can see how storytelling becomes embedded in commerce. You observe how packaging evolves into a communication tool. Colors, fonts, and symbols begin to carry meaning. A single glance is enough to suggest quality, origin, or prestige. Chocolate becomes recognizable even before it is opened. The act of purchasing chocolate becomes routine. It is no longer reserved for special occasions or elite contexts. It is integrated into daily life. People buy it alongside other goods, often without hesitation or reflection. A lesser-known cultural observation suggests that the increasing availability of packaged chocolate contributed to new patterns of personal consumption, where individuals could purchase and consume chocolate privately rather than in shared or ceremonial settings. You notice how privacy reshapes experience. You move through urban environments where chocolate advertisements appear in windows, posters, and early printed media. The substance is no longer only in stores, it is in imagery. It is becoming part of visual culture. A widely recognized historical fact is that the rise of industrial branding and advertising significantly influenced consumer perception of chocolate, helping to establish it as both an everyday treat and a symbol of comfort and pleasure in modern society. You begin to see how perception itself is shaped externally. You notice how consistency becomes a selling point. People expect chocolate to taste the same every time. Uniformity, once a technological achievement, is now a commercial promise. Reliability becomes part of identity. A quirky tidbit from early marketing history suggests that some chocolate companies experimented with collectible packaging and promotional materials, encouraging repeat purchases and brand loyalty through visual engagement beyond the product itself. You observe how consumption extends beyond taste. Inside homes, chocolate is now present in drawers, cupboards, and personal storage spaces. It is no longer something that must be sought out in specialized locations. It is accessible, familiar, and integrated into domestic life. You begin to see how chocolate has become emotionally coded. It is associated with comfort, reward, celebration, and small personal rituals. These associations are not accidental. They are reinforced through repetition and cultural reinforcement. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that chocolate became deeply embedded in modern consumer culture during the 20th century, evolving into a globally recognized product associated with both everyday enjoyment and special occasions. You can sense this dual identity forming. You pass through advertising spaces where chocolate is presented not just as food, but as experience. Images emphasize pleasure, relaxation, energy, or emotional connection. Chocolate becomes a language for feeling. A lesser-known cultural observation suggests that the emotional framing of chocolate in advertising contributed significantly to its global popularity, shaping consumer expectations around mood and experience rather than just taste or nutrition. You notice how emotion becomes part of commerce. The world around you feels increasingly interconnected. Chocolate is no longer tied to a single region or tradition. It moves through global supply chains, brand networks, and cultural interpretations that span continents. You pause and reflect on how far chocolate has traveled, From ritual drink to currency, from tribute system to industrial product, and now into branded identity. Each stage has added another layer rather than replacing what came before. A widely recognized historical interpretation emphasizes that chocolate's evolution into a branded consumer product represents one of the clearest examples of how industrialization and marketing together reshape cultural meaning on a global scale. You feel this transformation fully in the environment around you, and beyond these shelves, advertisements and carefully designed packages. Chocolate is already preparing for another transformation, one that will move it deeper into global networks of desire, ethics, and mass consumption that will define its modern identity. The branded shelves and polished retail spaces begin to dissolve behind you, not through disappearance, but through a widening of context. The story of chocolate is no longer contained within products, packaging, or even corporate identity alone. It is now embedded in people, labor, and entire communities built around production. You are entering the world where chocolate becomes not just a product of industry, but a system of social organization. You find yourself in an industrial town shaped by factories, transport lines, and tightly connected residential areas. The air carries a mixture of steam, smoke, and the faint sweetness of processing chocolate at scale. This is not the refined sweetness of shops or advertisements. It is heavier, more continuous, tied directly to labor and repetition. A widely recognized historical fact is that 19th century industrial chocolate production in Europe was closely associated with entrepreneurial families and companies, particularly those with Quaker backgrounds, who emphasized disciplined labor practices and consistent product quality. You observe how industry here is not only mechanical but also moral in its self-presentation. You move through factory grounds where chocolate production is now fully systematized. The machines you saw earlier are larger, more refined, and more integrated into coordinated workflows. Each stage feeds into the next without interruption. Cocoa processing is no longer experimental, it is optimized. Workers move with practice precision. Their roles are specialized. One group manages raw material input, another oversees refining, another handles molding and packaging. Chocolate is no longer shaped by individual hands but by coordinated systems of labor. A lesser-known industrial observation suggests that early factory systems often introduce strict time discipline into daily life, restructuring work schedules around machinery cycles rather than natural rhythms, which had lasting effects on both labor organization and urban living patterns. You begin to see how chocolate reshapes time itself. The surrounding town feels organized around production. Housing, transport, and commerce are all linked to factory operations. Chocolate is not just made here, it structures the entire local economy. You notice how families are connected to the industry across generations. Skills are passed down. Employment is stable but demanding. The factory becomes more than a workplace. It becomes a defining feature of identity. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that industrial chocolate manufacturers played a significant role in improving working conditions over time in certain regions, including investments in housing, education, and social welfare initiatives linked to factory communities. You see how industry begins to extend beyond production into social structure. Inside the factory, chocolate takes shape in increasingly refined forms. It is molded, cooled, packaged, and prepared for distribution. The consistency is remarkable. Each product is nearly identical to the next. Uniformity is no longer just a goal, it is an expectation. A quirky historical detail from industrial records notes that some early chocolate manufacturers experimented with new production techniques that reduced bitterness and improved texture, leading to gradual shifts in consumer preference towards smoother and creamier varieties. You can see how innovation quietly alters taste. The sound of machinery is constant but no longer overwhelming. It has become background rhythm, like the heartbeat of an entire region. Chocolate is present in every stage of life here, even when not directly visible. You step into administrative offices where production planning is coordinated. Documents, schedules, and output targets reflect a system that is both complex and highly organized. Chocolate is now managed as a continuous flow rather than discrete batches. A widely recognized historical fact is that industrialization of food production, including chocolate, contributed significantly to the rise of mass consumer markets in the 19th and early 20th centuries, fundamentally changing access to previously luxury goods. You begin to understand the scale of this transformation. Outside the factory, small shops and local vendors distribute chocolate products to nearby communities. It is no longer rare. It is part of daily consumption patterns. Children, workers, and families all encounter it regularly. You notice how chocolate is no longer just about taste or luxury. It is about availability. The ability to access something consistently reshapes its meaning more than any single marketing strategy ever could. A lesser-known social observation suggests that increased availability of chocolate contributed to its integration into everyday dietary habits, influencing not only consumption patterns but also cultural associations with reward and comfort in domestic life. You see how repetition creates meaning. You walk through residential streets where chocolate appears in household routines. This is part of celebrations, breaks, and small personal moments. It is no longer exceptional, it is familiar. A widely recognized historical fact is that companies producing chocolate during the industrial era increasingly targeted broader consumer populations through mass production and distribution, helping to establish chocolate as a global, everyday product rather than an elite luxury item. You can feel this shift in accessibility everywhere around you. You observe how packaging and branding continue to evolve, but now they are tied directly to large-scale distribution networks. Chocolate moves through railways, warehouses, and shipping systems that connect distant regions into a single commercial flow. A quirky tidbit from historical marketing archives notes that some chocolate companies introduced innovative promotional strategies such as collectible packaging, seasonal editions, and branded advertising campaigns that helped strengthen consumer loyalty and recognition. You notice how identity becomes commercially reinforced. Inside homes, chocolate is stored alongside other everyday goods. It is no longer treated as rare or ceremonial. It is part of pantry life. This quiet normalization marks a major transformation in its cultural role. You begin to see how chocolate now exists at multiple layers simultaneously. It is industrial product, cultural symbol, and emotional comfort all at once. None of these meanings cancel each other, they accumulate. A widely acknowledged historical interpretation emphasizes that industrial chocolate production not only increased accessibility, but also contributed to the standardization of taste across regions, gradually shaping global expectations of what chocolate should feel like. You can sense this standardization in every consistent bite imagined here. Historians still argue whether this standardization represented cultural loss through reduced diversity of preparation or cultural gain through shared global experience and accessibility across social classes. You find yourself standing inside both interpretations at once. The factory town continues its rhythm around you. Nothing feels temporary, everything is sustained by repetition and coordination and shared systems of production. A widely acknowledged historical interpretation emphasizes that chocolate's global success is not only a result of taste and accessibility, but also of its ability to adapt to cultural expectations, emotional narratives, and economic systems across different societies. You begin to see it as a highly flexible cultural form. You notice how deeply chocolate is now embedded in memory. It is tied to childhood experiences, personal milestones, shared celebrations, and everyday comfort moments. These associations are not accidental, they are culturally reinforced over time. A lesser-known psychological observation suggests that repeated exposure to chocolate in emotionally positive contexts contributes to strong associative memory patterns, linking its sensory experience with feelings of comfort and reward across many cultures. You recognize how memory shapes perception. The global landscape of chocolate feels vast and interconnected. From farms to factories to retail spaces to personal consumption, it forms a continuous loop of production and meaning. Yet within this vast system, individual moments remain deeply personal. Historians still argue whether modern chocolate represents a loss of earlier cultural specificity or a gain in global shared experience that transcends regional boundaries through common sensory familiarity. You can feel both interpretations coexisting in the present moment. As you move beyond this global network of consumption and emotion, chocolate is already preparing for its final transformation in this journey, where it will become reflection, memory, and quiet presence within the human experience itself. The noise of the global chocolate world begins to soften as you move away from markets, advertisements, factories, and supply chains that once felt endless in scale. The shift is subtle at first. It is not that chocolate disappears, it is that it stops behaving like something external and begins to settle into something internal. The story no longer unfolds in cities or systems, it unfolds in perception. You find yourself in a quieter space, not defined by geography but by attention. The pace slows. The sharp edges of industrial production, global trade, and emotional branding begin to dissolve into something more fluid. Chocolate is no longer only a commodity, or a symbol, or a ritual object, it is becoming memory layered over memory. A widely recognized historical fact is that chocolate, across its long history, has continuously adapted its form and meaning, shifting from ceremonial drink in Mesoamerica to a globally consumed confection shaped by industrial, cultural, and emotional forces. You feel that entire arc compressed into a single presence here, as if all its histories are happening at once. You notice how your perception of chocolate is no longer tied to a single moment or location. Instead, it feels like a sequence of transformations that can be recalled without effort. Bitter foam in ancient gatherings, counted beans in marketplaces, imperial tribute moving through cities, ocean voyages, factory rhythms, branded shelves, and global consumption all coexist in the same mental space. A lesser-known psychological observation suggests that repeated cultural exposure to a single food item across different life stages can embed it deeply into collective memory structures, allowing it to function as both sensory experience and symbolic reference point. You begin to understand why chocolate feels so familiar even when its history is so complex. The boundaries between past and present soften further. You're no longer moving through time, you're observing how time has layered itself into perception. Chocolate becomes a thread that connects all these layers without needing to explain them. A widely acknowledged cultural interpretation emphasizes that certain foods achieve enduring global significance not only because of their material properties, but because they accumulate meaning through repeated cultural reinvention across centuries. You can feel chocolate carrying these accumulated reinventions like sediment in water, still moving, but enriched by everything it has passed through. You think back to forests where cacao was first tended, to markets where it functioned as currency, to imperial cities where it structured power, to ships crossing oceans, to European rooms filled with careful debate, to factories filled with mechanical rhythm, to shelves filled with branded promise, to global systems of distribution and emotion. Each stage remains present, not as a sequence, but as a coexistence. A quirky historical reflection often noted in cultural studies is that objects with long trade histories tend to become memory carriers, holding traces of multiple societies simultaneously, even when their modern form appears standardized or simplified. Chocolate feels like exactly that kind of object, layered with invisible histories that are still active beneath the surface. Now the sensory world around you narrows. You're no longer observing large systems. You are aware of small, intimate details. The imagined texture of chocolate on the tongue, the soft sweetness dissolving slowly, the faint bitterness underneath it, the way it melts and disappears while still leaving a trace behind. A widely recognized sensory fact is that chocolate's combination of fat, sugar, and cocoa compounds creates a distinctive melting behavior that interacts strongly with human taste perception, contributing to its widespread emotional and sensory appeal across cultures. You notice how even this physical detail becomes part of its deeper story. Thoughts slow further. Chocolate is no longer being analyzed. It is being experienced as a memory that does not belong to any single moment. It could be childhood. It could be a gift. It could be a quiet pause in a busy day. It could be all of these at once. A lesser-known cognitive observation suggests that emotionally charged foods often become anchors for autobiographical memory, allowing individuals to associate taste with periods of life rather than isolated events. You begin to see chocolate not as one experience, but as many lives layered together. The world feels quieter now, not empty, but softened. The urgency of trade, industry, and global systems fades into the background. What remains is continuity. Chocolate continues, not as a product moving through systems, but as a presence that has already been absorbed into human experience. A widely acknowledged historical interpretation suggests that chocolate's enduring global presence is less about a single defining moment and more about its continuous reinvention across cultures, economies, and technologies, each layer adding to its accumulated identity. You feel this continuity as something still unfolding, even here. There is no longer a sense of movement forward. Instead, there is settling. Each earlier stage of chocolate's journey is still present, but none dominates. They exist together as overlapping impressions rather than linear history. You become aware of how silence itself feels different now. It is not absence. It is fullness without noise. Chocolate is present in that silence as memory, as sensation, as cultural trace, as shared human reference that does not need explanation. A quirky cultural observation notes that some of the most globally recognized foods gain their emotional significance not from their origins, but from their ability to accompany ordinary life consistently across generations and geographies. Chocolate feels exactly like that kind of presence, both ordinary and deeply layered. Breathing slows, attention narrows further. The idea of chocolate no longer feels like something external to be understood. It feels internal, already known, already integrated into the structure of experience itself. A widely recognized reflective interpretation emphasizes that long histories of cultural exchange often leave behind objects that function as condensed symbols of human interaction, carrying within them traces of trade, adaptation, conflict, creativity, and comfort all at once. Chocolate stands as one of those condensed symbols. Now even reflection begins to fade, not because it ends, but because it softens into stillness. The story is no longer unfolding in stages, it is resting in completion. Every transformation remains present without needing to be revisited. You're no longer following chocolate through time, you are simply aware of it as something that has always been moving alongside human life, changing shape but never leaving it. And as everything quiets further, chocolate remains not as a journey, but as a lingering presence at the edge of thought, slowly dissolving into calm, sweet dreams.